Hey, welcome to week 9. I know it's been a while since you've seen a video by your professor, but that's the way this course has been laid out, and now we're getting close to the end of the term. Now this is a short week and we're only dealing with one topic, which is voting rights, there's really two sort of phases of voting rights to look at. There's the historical phase, which is covered in the reading for this week pretty well. And so I'm going to talk about voting rights issues today, and I'll just note that the historical side of voting rights is all about the various groups that were excluded from the right to vote at the founding of the nation, struggling to gain official recognition as well as then actual access to the ballot. And that has actually been one of the biggest, most important stories in American political history, is the expansion of voting rights to include all adult citizens, and that has been formally achieved. There are still, though, the issues of ballot access and obstacles. So in terms of formal exclusion, those battles have been won. Every adult citizen has the right to vote, with the exception of, in some states, convicted felons don't have the right to vote. They lose the right to vote either while they're in jail in some states or for some probationary period. That has actually been changed. In Florida recently, a statewide ballot measure was passed to re-enfranchise felons, to give them the right to vote, and then the Florida state legislature actually passed a law piggybacking on that, requiring that felons pay back all of their fees and fines and court costs before they actually get the right to vote back. So there really is, there still is this kind of marginal struggle to make sure that every adult citizen has a formal right to vote. And at the edges there, and really it's the felon issue where there's an actual formal exclusion there, and there are positive and negative reasons for that, and there are good arguments on both sides. What I want to look at today is obstacles to ballot access. People who have the formal right to vote, but who face difficulties in exercising that right to vote because of certain kinds of state policies. And one thing to note is that the voter turnout rate in the United States is relatively low for advanced democracies. We just had a presidential election where we had a historically high voter turnout, and that historically high voter turnout was something, in the end, it'll be, all the votes haven't been counted yet, but it'll be somewhere between 65 and 68% of the eligible voters cast a vote for president in this election. That, as the historical high, is pretty pathetic. Denmark just had an election last year, and they had 85% voter turnout, and that was not an extraordinary year for Denmark. Among the advanced democracies, the United States has one of the lowest voting turnout rates. Now, part of the reason for that is that some people choose not to vote. Another reason for that is that some groups face obstacles which, while they're not prevented legally from voting, no one says you don't get the right to vote, they face obstacles enough that it actually, they're likely to self-disenfranchise. Now, before you kind of say, well, if people choose not to vote because it's a hassle to them, or they don't feel like it's important, or there are obstacles, well, then that's their problem. That is one way to look at it, to take the personal responsibility lens and say, if people choose not to vote, even if it's difficult, great, fine. Let them. That's what it means to live in a freedom, a liberty-loving country, is to let people choose to vote or not vote. And we can't say there's anything wrong with the system if there's no formal exclusion. In this lecture, I want to look at, though, the possibility that you can get people to self-disenfranchise, to choose not to vote, in ways that we can recognize are essentially less their personal responsibility and their fault, and more an intention to suppress or depress voter turnout. I shouldn't say suppress, because implies definitely an active, like, you aren't going to vote, we're going to get in your way. Depress voter turnout is probably the better term. How do you depress voter turnout, and why would you do that? Well, there are two reasons. One, you could put into place policies, and all election laws are in the hands of the states. There are federal laws, but the elections are in the hands of the states. So the states are really taking the lead on election laws and election policies and election procedures. in a state, you can say, well, we want to make our election system relatively affordable. We don't want to spend a ton of money. We want to make it secure. We want to make sure that only people who are eligible to vote can actually vote. And we want to make sure that it is efficient and accurate. So there are values that can underlie certain kinds of policies that could have the effect of depressing voter turnout, making it more difficult and making some people be like, well, it's not worth it, it's too difficult, and so they self-disenfranchise. The other side, the sort of more, think of it as the sinister side, is that there are politicians and parties that want to depress voter turnout among certain kinds of voters because those voters are less likely to vote for them, their party and their party's candidates. And so by making it harder for those groups to vote, they're actually making it easier for their party to win elections. On the other side, there could be efforts by parties to increase ballot access because that will make it easier for people to vote who are likely to vote for your side. And then, of course, there's just the philosophical argument that in a democracy, ballot access ought to be easy and automatic, and everybody who wants to vote ought to have as little difficulty as possible voting, and that is an underlying value as well. On the one side, there's fiscal responsibility, efficiency, security, accuracy as values that might lead to policies that will make it difficult for people to vote, create obstacles, and I'll talk about what they are in a minute. And then there's the flip side, which is we ought to do everything we can to make sure everybody who wants to vote gets to vote. Now, I will point out that I've talked about parties generically, that generally the two major parties, the Republicans and Democrats, have different views on voter access, and they have different consequences when certain groups either have greater access or have more challenging access. The Republican Party tends to be the party in favor of restrictions on voting in the name of fiscal responsibility, accuracy, security, efficiency, ease of count. And the reason why that fits with their philosophy. It also fits with their political agenda, which is to win elections. Parties are always trying to win elections. That's what they do. Because the groups that tend to vote at lower turnout rates, just across the board, are less educated, poorer, and minorities. And those groups, while people in any of those categories do vote Republican, those groups tend to vote more strongly for the Democratic Party than they do for the Republican Party. So Republicans don't have a problem with those groups self-disenfranchising or facing greater obstacles because it makes it easier for them to win elections. Democrats, on the other hand, rely on the votes of minorities and less well-educated people and poorer people. And they tend to want to make ballot access easier for all groups of people. It fits their philosophy. It also fits their political agenda, which is to win elections. And so the the ballot access issue is philosophical because, okay, you can't just say, well, here's pieces of paper, vote, right? You have to have procedures. You have to have laws. It is important to make sure that there's security, that there's accuracy, that there's not fraud. But where to put that line? And the two different parties have a different, essentially, incentive to increase ballot access. Democrats have a strong incentive to widen voter access, and Republicans have a political incentive to narrow voter access. So, what are the ways in which these things happen? There are a number of different regulations that make it easier or harder for people to vote. First is registration and identification, right? If it's really easy to register to vote and you don't need a lot of paperwork, you don't need a lot of, there's not a lot of administrative hassle to register and then cast a ballot, more people are going to do it, right? And the idea of requiring identification, you have to have a driver's license. Well, that seems simple to those of us who have driver's licenses. It is for a number of Americans, for many Americans, it's challenging to get official ID. It takes time, it takes money, it takes effort, and if you're a poor and struggling and marginalized person, these kinds of things could be more challenging to you. And so voter identification laws that require you to have identification to vote, to prove that you are the person you are, or to even just to register to vote, definitely are, it seems like it's a security issue and it's an anti-fraud issue. It is. It also means that the more people have to go through to get their ballot in their hands, the more people are going to not do that. And the people who aren't going to do that are going to be the people who are challenged, struggling in terms of language skills, in terms of poverty where they have to work a lot, in terms of administrative hassle where they actually have to navigate a government bureaucracy. So the one way to depress voter turnout, to create obstacles in the name of security and anti-fraud, is to have voter identification. Registration is also varies from state to state. When you have to be registered before you can vote varies. In some states, they have same-day registration. It's election day. You can walk into a polling place and you can register and vote that very same day. In other states, there are deadlines that range from 2 weeks to a month before you can actually vote. You have to be registered in advance. So same-day registration increases ballot access because it means that anyone can vote, register and vote on the same day in the same trip, the same interaction with the federal with a government bureaucracy. If you have registration deadlines that are before election day, then people have to make essentially 2 trips, 2 administrative interactions. And while that doesn't sound like that big of a deal, think about think about when you have to go renew your driver's license, or when you have to go get your car inspected, or when you have to go get a new student ID because you lost it. The administrative hassle is an obstacle, even for people who it's going to be just a 10-minute interaction. You just drive over there, you do it. It's still a hassle. So imagine that you are a person who is more challenged with managing your life and doing things, and also it seems daunting, and maybe you're going to have to wait 2 hours instead of 10 minutes. It's going to seem like, why bother, right? It's just one vote. Why bother registering 2 weeks before the election and then going and voting on election day? So registration deadlines are another issue, and those groups who want to increase ballot access are pushing for same-day registration, ease of registration. Some states have laws where you automatically get registered. My 16-year-old son is registered already to vote here in Oregon as soon as he turns 18, because in school, as soon as they do something, I think they actually registered them to vote when they turn 16. The school does it. Obviously, that makes it easier. In other states, you actually have to then go and fill out some kind of form. Now, years ago, the Congress passed what's called the motor voter law, which is that as soon as you go and get your driver's license, you're automatically registered in whatever state your driver's license is, and that increased ballot access. But you still have to go and get a driver's license in order for that to happen. Now, most people have driver's licenses, and so the motor voter law actually took care of a voter registration obstacle. But if you move from one state to another, the motor voter law doesn't do any good if you keep your old license, and a lot of people do. When I moved from Washington State to Oregon, I kept my Washington license until it expired, which I think was 3 years later, just because I didn't want to have to go deal with it. I didn't want to have to take the test. I didn't want to have to fill out the paperwork. I didn't want to have to wait hours. I actually have plenty of time, and I have skill at dealing with government bureaucracies. So it wasn't that big of an obstacle for me, yet I dragged my feet for 3 years. So these are ways in which also there are potential obstacles. Other obstacles are especially about polling places and poll access. If you live in a state where you actually have to go vote to a place. Here in Oregon, we have mail-in balloting. Our ballots arrive at our door, and we get a voter pamphlet with all the information we need, and we can either put our ballot in the mail for free, or we can take it to a drop box, which is there are a number of drop boxes around. All of the public libraries in Multnomah County are drop boxes, and there are other drop boxes. We actually have a very easy voting system. I would say the easiest voting system in the United States is in Oregon. If you live in a state that doesn't have that, then you have to go vote on election day. Or you have to go vote during the early voting period. So this is another ballot access issue. If you live in a state that only allows you to vote on election day, you have to vote on the first Tuesday in November, and that's the only time you have to go. Whatever else is going on in your life. If you live in a state that has early voting for 2 weeks, or for 3 weeks, or for a week, or some states actually have weekend voting for the whole month before the election, you have more choices. So the number of choices that you have, or the restriction of your choices, is going to increase or decrease voter turnout, and increase or decrease the factors that depress voter turnout. Now, mostly people who are well educated and well off, middle class or above, and who are white, have very little difficulty voting, even when you have to vote on election day. And the reason why that is because it's built into their lives. The more money you make, the easier it is to take off a couple hours to go vote. If you live in an affluent area, you probably have a car and it's easier to get there. You don't have to take public transportation. So the amount of time you have to vote makes a big difference in voting access. Also, and this is a really important thing, how long will you have to wait to vote? In a state where you have only election day to vote, everybody's got to go. And that's going to mean there's going to be long lines. And some people are just going to say, even if it's not a pandemic, but especially in a pandemic, like, I just don't want to go wait in a long line in order to be able to cast my one vote that's not going to break any ties, so the hell with it, right? If there's 2 weeks of early voting and you can go on a day when the lines are short, or you can actually just, on election day, the lines will be shorter because many people will have voted early, you're going to have less of an obstacle. The amount of time. This sounds trivial sometimes when I talk about it, like, really people, one of their most important civic powers, the right to vote, people are going to decide whether to use that civic power based on how long the line is. But yes, the answer is yes. And think about your own life. Do you want to go do something that's going to take a long time? If it took less time, you would be much more likely to do it. Waiting time is largely dependent on how long you have to vote. And I think one of the things that's probably going to happen, this is a prediction of mine, but it's going to happen as a result of the pandemic, when a lot of states added early voting periods that they didn't have in the past, and Americans got the experience of having an ease of ballot access. Like, oh, I can just go whatever day. The election day is not election day. Election day is election deadline. I have until election day to get my ballot in. I think that the kind of emergency policies that were put into place for the pandemic to make it easy for people to vote are going to probably be pushed for in the future. So there will be fewer lines. Now, one other factor that impacts line length and waiting time is the number of polling places available. If you live in a city that has 20,000 people and there is one polling place in the center of town, and you have to go on election day and vote, that's a pretty major choke point. That means that 20,000 people, and actually probably in a town of 20,000, some of them are children, however many eligible voters there are, 10, 15,000, are going to have to all go to one place, and that's going to definitely mean there's going to be a long line. Now, that's efficient and cost effective for the government to have one polling place per 15,000 voters, because they don't have to have 15 polling places and hire all those workers and have all the different equipment and have all the voting machines. So there's an efficiency aspect to paring down the number of polling places. But the fewer polling places you have, the longer the lines are going to be, the more daunting it's going to be. And also, the distance people have to travel is, for some people, going to be more prohibitive than others, right? If you live in a sprawly town of 20,000 people and the one polling place is in the center of town, people who live in the center of town are going to be able to walk there and get there very easily. People who live in the outlying areas, if they don't have cars, they're going to have to take public transportation or get a ride or walk, and that's going to, again, increase the obstacles. The more obstacles, even if each individual obstacle is sort of trivial in its own right, the more obstacles that you put in people's way, the lower the turnout rate is going to be. Some people will overcome every obstacle, right? Some people will walk uphill both ways through waist-deep snow to cast their one vote, but many people will choose not to do that. So, number of polling places. If you have, instead of one polling place for that town of 20,000, if you have 10, lines are going to be shorter. People are going to have to travel less far to get there. It will be easier to do. So, more polling places. One of the things that has been happening in Republican-controlled states is that they've been cutting back on the number of polling places available in the name of fiscal responsibility and efficiency, right? We have fewer polling places, which means fewer voting machines, fewer poll workers, less money spent on security, less money spent on transporting ballots to where they're being counted. So there's an effect. There's a financial efficiency argument. But what that does is that then increases the obstacles because people have to travel farther and wait in longer lines. These are the voting rights issues of today that impact ballot access. Registration, amount of time to vote, number of polling places, all of these either increase or decrease essentially the challenge, the regular old get up out of bed, put on clothes, go and cast my ballot kind of obstacles. And again, as I've said it several times, it might seem kind of trivial, like it's your voice. Your vote is your voice in our democratic society. So if it's a hassle to get there, just overcome the hassle. That's easy to say, and that's the personal responsibility argument, but in terms of the system, the more of those obstacles there are, the more likely it is that certain groups are going to have their voter turnout depressed, is going to go down. It's not outright suppression, where you're actually blocking people from voting, but it is definitely depresses voter turnout. So those are the voting rights issues today, and that is where the voting rights battle is being fought in the 2020s.